For many years, I quietly supported my in-laws financially, never once asking for acknowledgement or appreciation. I did it out of goodwill and familial duty. But recently, I uncovered the painful truth behind their long-standing disdain toward me, and the revelation exploded into a dramatic and unforgettable confrontation at their anniversary celebration. Let me back up and give you a bit of background about who I am and how this whole situation unfolded. My name is Elise. I'm 34 years old, and I've been married to my husband Landon, who's 36, for the past 9 years. We've been together a total of 12 years, and for most of that time we've been incredibly close, more like soulmates than just partners. More like fight or argue, except when the topic of his parents comes up. That's where things get complicated. From the very beginning of our relationship, I sensed that Landon's parents were never too fond of me. Despite my best efforts to be friendly, kind, and respectful, there was always this unspoken chill in the air whenever I was around them. It was subtle at first, polite but distant behavior, offhand comments that felt a little too pointed, or polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I brushed it off initially, telling myself I was imagining it, but as time passed, it became undeniable. Still, I had no clue why they were so cold toward me. I racked my brain trying to figure out what I might have done to offend them, but nothing ever came to mind. They never openly expressed their disapproval. That is, until just a few days ago at their big anniversary gathering, when all their feelings came pouring out in front of everyone. Before I dive into that moment, it's important to explain our family's dynamic, especially when it comes to my marriage and career. After we tied the knot, about a year into our marriage, Landon and I had a long, honest conversation about our future. I was working at my father's electrical appliance business and earning significantly more than Landon was at his job. We both realized that the traditional path wasn't necessary for us. Landon wasn't happy at work. He found his job draining and unfulfilling, and he wanted to contribute in a different way. He proposed that he take on the role of managing the household, cooking, cleaning, running errands, and being the glue that held our daily life together. I was a bit surprised at first, not because I had an issue with the arrangement, but because it was such a big shift. Still, the idea made sense. He'd be happier, and I'd have the support I needed to focus on advancing in the company, which I was poised to take over once my father retired. It was a joint decision, one we made thoughtfully and without pressure from anyone else. For the last 8 years, Landon has been a dedicated and efficient homemaker. Meanwhile, my father retired 6 years ago, and I stepped up as the CEO. I don't say this to boast, but we've done incredibly well for ourselves financially. Landon and I are content. We've built a life based on mutual respect and cooperation. That's what makes this whole situation with his parents so frustrating. Despite everything we've accomplished and the happiness we found together, Landon's parents, particularly his mother Sheila and father Bob, have always viewed our marriage through a distorted lens. They assumed Landon was the main breadwinner. To be fair, we never actually corrected them on that assumption, but the omission was intentional. You see, Sheila and Bob are very traditional in their views. They believe a man should provide for his family, work a full-time job, and lead in every aspect of his household. Landon knew that revealing the truth, that he had willingly chosen to be a stay-at-home husband while I ran the business, would spark outrage and judgment. So, we decided it was best to let them believe he still worked at his former company. Whenever the topic came up, we'd steer the conversation elsewhere, never offering details, never correcting their assumptions. It worked, for the most part. We managed to avoid uncomfortable discussions and awkward family confrontations, but it came at a price. Because they didn't know the full story, they clung to the belief that I had somehow manipulated their son or diminished his role as a man, that I wasn't wife material. To make matters more delicate, Landon's parents already disliked me before we even walked down the aisle. No matter what I did, I couldn't win them over, and with their health issues, we didn't feel like we could just cut ties. Sheila is a 2-time cancer survivor. She's fought off skin cancer and, later, brain cancer, both incredibly tough battles. She's currently in remission, and we're grateful every day for her recovery. Her strength is admirable, and even though she's never been warm to me, I never let that affect the way I treated her. Bob, on the other hand, has had 2 heart attacks in the past 4 years. Watching both of them go through so much made it hard to justify walking away from the relationship, even if it was strained. Landon and I agreed that it wasn't the time to cut them out. Their health complications meant we needed to be supportive, not distant. So I continued to show up, to care, and to help. Yes, financially. While Landon's parents believed he was working a stable job, the truth is that any time they needed help covering bills or medical expenses, I was the one writing the checks. Bob and Sheila are both retired, and though they never said it out loud, they leaned on us more than they probably realized, and Landon, being the kind-hearted person he is, never denied their requests. But he also didn't have access to the kind of money I did. Every time they needed assistance, repairs, prescriptions, travel costs, I made sure it was taken care of. I did it silently, never demanding recognition, never pointing out that I was the one making things happen behind the scenes. I thought I was building goodwill, that maybe over time their perception of me would change. But I was wrong. And as it turns out, everything came to a boiling point in the most public way possible. Their anniversary party, intended as a celebration of love and endurance, became the backdrop for a revelation I never saw coming. A room full of family and friends, music playing, toasts being made, and then chaos. Whenever my in-laws needed financial help, whether it was for medical bills, house repairs, or even just luxury items to enjoy their retirement, I was the one quietly signing the checks. But I always made sure the payments were labeled as being from both Landon and me. I knew that if the money came solely from me, it would raise eyebrows. We didn't want them to start questioning where the funds were coming from, which could have led them to the truth about Landon's employment status, or rather, the fact that he hadn't held a job outside our home in the past 8 years. Their lifestyle. Every cruise, every dinner at a 5-star restaurant, every designer handbag or fancy watch, was possible because of my income. And while I never expected them to shower me with praise or fall at my feet in gratitude, I did think a little acknowledgement wouldn't have been too much to ask. Even if they thought Landon and I were both contributing financially, I was still part of that equation. I had hoped they'd at least extend some basic decency in return. But that hope was naive. Most recently, I'd gone out of my way to plan and pay for a lavish party to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. I spent weeks coordinating with caterers, decorators, florists, and entertainers. The venue was spectacular, the ambiance just right, and every detail was curated to their taste. And again, the story that was told to everyone was that Landon and I had organized the event together. That was fine, I didn't mind sharing credit, but I did hope that perhaps, finally, this gesture might thaw the icy relationship between us. What I didn't expect was for the evening to take such a dark turn. From the moment we arrived at the celebration, I could tell something was off. Sheila and Bob Langan's parents were acting unusually stiff, even for them. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air, a silent storm gathering. Later, I would realize it was because of the new car I had recently purchased. Just a couple of weeks before the party, I had treated myself to a beautiful luxury vehicle. It worked incredibly hard, and I felt I deserved something nice. Meanwhile, Landon still drove his older, well-maintained car. He didn't mind either. It suited his needs, and he wasn't the type to care about flashy things. That evening, Landon had gone to his parents' house earlier in the day to help with some last-minute preparations. I had to finish work, so I arrived separately, pulling up in my new car. Apparently, that didn't sit well with my in-laws. It seemed to serve as visual confirmation of whatever suspicions had been brewing in their minds. When the time came for them to give a speech, I was expecting something sweet and sentimental, a reflection on 40 years of marriage, perhaps a few funny anecdotes, and maybe a thank you to their guests. Instead, what followed was nothing short of a public ambush. Sheila stepped forward, holding the microphone with a look of grim determination. Bob stood beside her, nodding in agreement. They started off by talking about their long journey together, 4 decades of love and partnership, but then they shifted gears. They said there was something they'd been holding back for far too long. Something they needed to say. And then they turned their eyes toward me. They accused me, in front of dozens of friends and relatives, of exploiting their son, of living off his hard work and generosity, of being a parasite who had contributed nothing while enjoying the fruits of his labor. They pointed out the expensive car I had just driven up in, and contrasted it with Landon's modest vehicle. They talked about how he wore simple clothes while I always appeared dressed in designer brands, dripping in accessories. According to them, I was flaunting a lifestyle that wasn't mine to claim. They said they'd kept quiet all these years hoping I would change, but now, nearly a decade into the marriage, it was clear to them that I never would. They accused me of being a gold digger boldly, unapologetically, and with full conviction. I was stunned. I could feel the eyes of every guest turn toward me. The weight of their judgment was suffocating. The air was thick with shock, and I stood frozen, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. But then something inside me snapped. Being cold to me in private was one thing. Ignoring me during family dinners, leaving me out of conversations, never thanking me for anything, I had learned to live with that. But to humiliate me in public, to stand up at an event I had planned and paid for, and to degrade me so viciously in front of everyone, that was a line I could not allow them to cross without consequence. So I walked up to the stage. As I approached, Sheila tried to stop me, insisting there was no need to argue in public, but I made it clear that I wasn't there to argue, I was there to tell the truth. I took the microphone and addressed the crowd. I explained that for the past 8 years Landon hadn't held a traditional job, not because he couldn't, but because we had made a conscious, mutual decision. I told them that Landon had become a house husband, and that I was the primary earner in our household. I was the one who funded our lifestyle, including every vacation, every medical expense, and yes, even the car I had just driven in that evening. I revealed that the entire time they thought I was dependent on their son, the reality was the exact opposite. I had been supporting not only Landon but also them. I told the guests that every check they'd received, every generous gesture they credited to their son, had come from me. I told them Landon wore simple clothes because he chose to. He didn't care about material things. But no one, not even his own parents, had the right to use his preferences as a weapon against me. The room was dead silent. Not a whisper, not a cough, just stunned faces and dropped jaws. I knew I had shattered the illusion they had built, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. It wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity. That night, Landon's parents have been relentless, calling, texting, accusing us of embarrassing them, of making them look foolish, but Landon has stood by me, unwavering. He told me he was proud of me for speaking up, and honestly, I think we both knew this day was inevitable. They tore me down in front of everyone. I simply told the truth in return. Standing there in the aftermath of the anniversary party, I remember telling Landon, and later admitting to myself, that maybe, just maybe, the real mistake was not being honest with his parents from the start about our financial arrangement. Perhaps if we had simply told them that I was the one earning and Landon had chosen to stay home, we might have avoided some of this drama. But even as I considered that possibility, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that none of it would have made a difference. The root of their resentment wasn't about deception, it was about who I was, or rather, who I wasn't, in their eyes. For 8 long years I had played an equal part, if not more, in helping his parents with money whenever they asked. Every contribution we made, every check we sent, had both of our names on it. There was never a moment when I tried to hide my involvement, and yet not once had they shown any genuine gratitude. And that was before we ever lied to them. Before the secret about our household arrangement even existed, they had already decided they didn't like me. So yes, we lied, but not out of malice. We did it to preserve a fragile peace. We did it because Landon knew that if they ever found out the truth, they'd weaponize it. They'd hound him to man up and get a job. They'd treat me as some sort of emasculating villain, and the emotional toll would have been unbearable. Cutting them off entirely wasn't an option, either, not with Sheila and Bob both facing major health crises. If we had turned our backs on them, the guilt would have eaten us alive. And now that the truth was finally out, I felt no reason to continue allowing them to berate me. There was no mask left to wear, no script left to follow. So after their public outburst, Landon and I left. As we walked out of the venue, I glanced at the crowd. Most of the guests looked uncomfortable, even disgusted, not at me, but at the scene Landon's parents had created. It was a small consolation, but it meant something to know that others saw what I saw. That night, back at home, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in nearly a decade, we no longer had to live under the weight of that carefully maintained lie. No more pretending, no more dodging questions, no more half-truths. The secret was out, and we were free. But the peace didn't last long. The very next morning, Landon received a call from his parents. At first, we thought it might be an attempt to apologize or at least clear the air. But no, they called to tell him how deeply wrong everything that happened at the party was, how we had humiliated them. Sheila, in particular, was furious. She claimed that my speech had made them look like terrible parents in front of everyone they knew, and as for me, in her words, I was a cruel, manipulative woman who had destroyed their image for the sake of public spectacle. I listened quietly while Landon spoke to them on the phone, only a few feet away from where I sat. I could hear every word, every shout from Sheila echoing through the speaker. When I finally heard her voice scream that we had gaslighted them for years, I knew there was no salvaging this relationship. They weren't angry that we had lied. They were angry that I had taken their narrative away from them. Angry that they could no longer use the illusion of their hard-working son and his dependent wife as a shield for their old-fashioned ideals. And more than anything, they were enraged that people now knew the truth. Sheila said they would never forgive us, that because of my speech, they had become the laughingstock among their friends and family. And then, in the most bizarre twist of all, she said they didn't want any of my money ever again. They wanted us to send them a list of every expense we had ever covered so they could pay it all back, even if it meant selling everything they owned. They told Landon they didn't mind taking help from him, their son, but from me, the liar, the fraud, never again. That's when the guilt started creeping in, not because I thought I had done something wrong, but because I couldn't believe it had come to this. After everything I had given them, not just financially but emotionally, After all the times I had bitten my tongue, put their needs ahead of my pride, tried to be a part of their family, they still hated me. And I didn't understand why. Landon, bless his heart, finally demanded an answer. He asked them directly, for the first time, why they had never liked me, why they couldn't bring themselves to see past whatever it was they held against me, why, even knowing how much I had done for them, they still treated me like an outsider. They dodged the question. They shifted the conversation back to the lie. They said we had made fools of them in public, but Landon wasn't having it. He reminded them that I had done everything for that anniversary party. I coordinated the vendors, handled the bookings, and organized every detail. They knew that. They had seen it with their own eyes, and yet even that hadn't been enough. And that's when the screaming really started. Sheila's voice was so loud I could hear every furious word from where I sat. She raged about betrayal, about disgrace, about how everyone hated them now. She hung up in a storm of insults, and we sat there stunned. Since then, they've sent dozens of messages to Landon, demands for financial itemizations, declarations that they want to sever ties, claims that they're repulsed by our deception. It's clear now that this isn't about one party or one lie. It's about a grudge they've been holding on to since the beginning. So now, I find myself asking, am I the bad person here? Was it wrong to hide the truth about Landon's employment? Was it cruel to expose it all in a speech, even if I only did it after being humiliated? Was it a betrayal, or was it self-defense? It's been 1 week since that night, and after much discussion, Landon and I have come to a decision. We've blocked them. Phone, social media, email, everything. We've cut them off. We don't do it out of spite. We do it because we have finally accepted what we should have seen all along, that they never wanted to accept me. It didn't matter what I did, it never would have. I do regret lying. I know it made things worse, but I no longer believe the truth would have changed anything. I stayed connected to them because I felt sorry that they had been through so much, because I didn't want to be the one who took their son away. But now, it's clear that they were never interested in keeping him. Not really, not if it meant accepting me too. Since that explosive anniversary party, Landon has reached a breaking point with his parents. Every single day he's been apologizing to me personally, apologizing for not standing up to them sooner, for not anticipating their behavior, for dragging me into a relationship with people who clearly never wanted me around. I kept reminding him, gently but firmly, that none of this was his fault. He cannot control the choices or the temperaments of others, even if those people are his own flesh and blood. I wanted him to understand that I never held him accountable for their cruelty. Surprisingly, several of Landon's relatives had reached out to me in the aftermath. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all wanted to express their shock and disapproval at what his parents had done. Many of them were in attendance at the party and had witnessed firsthand the appalling way Sheila and Bob treated me. They reassured me that they saw the truth now, that I had never deserved the coldness and mistreatment I endured for nearly a decade. Some of them even said they'd decided to cut off contact with Landon's parents entirely. I didn't take pleasure in hearing that. Truthfully, I didn't feel any sense of vindication or triumph, because at the end of the day, no matter how hurtful they've been, Sheila and Bob are still two elderly people with a long history of illness and trauma. Lonely, bitter, and emotionally unstable. I'm not someone who takes delight in the suffering of others, even those who've treated me poorly. But I also wasn't going to discourage others from doing what they felt was necessary for their own peace. If Landon's relatives no longer wanted anything to do with his parents, that was their decision, not mine to interfere with. I wouldn't stop them, but I wouldn't cheer them on either. Emotionally drained and mentally exhausted, Landon and I decided to take a short trip to clear our heads. We needed space, physically and emotionally, from all of it. A break to breathe, to reflect, and to finally just be alone with each other without the shadow of his parents looming over us. We chose the beach, a quiet stretch of coast not far from the city, where the waves were soothing and the sun was warm. Just one weekend to recharge, to forget, to feel like ourselves again. That was the plan. But reality had other ideas. Barely into our first full day of the getaway, I received an unexpected and alarming phone call. It was from our home security company. They had detected a breach, a potential break-in, and the alarm system had been triggered. My heart dropped into my stomach. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, who it had to be. Bob and Sheila. Without wasting a second, I opened the app connected to our security cameras and reviewed the live feed. What I saw left me speechless. There they were, standing outside our front door, pressing the bell repeatedly for what must have been 15 straight minutes. And then, when no one responded, they resorted to something I never imagined two elderly people would do. They brought bricks with them, actual bricks, and they used them to shatter the large bay window in our living room. The very window we'd paid a small fortune to install just a few months ago. They climbed through the broken glass and entered our house. They hadn't left by the time I got the alert, which meant they were still inside. I called the police immediately. I also contacted my next-door neighbor, a close friend who thankfully acted fast. Within 30 minutes, law enforcement was at our house, and Bob and Sheila were escorted off the property. Whether the district attorney would press charges or not was yet to be determined, but at that moment, I was too furious to care. They had broken into our home, damaged our property, and violated the one space where we were supposed to feel safe. It was reckless, bizarre, and desperate behavior, especially from people their age. But it also made me realize how far they were willing to go just to cling to control over Landon's life. My neighbor helped me get a temporary fix for the broken window, a cheaper, makeshift replacement for the time being, but it was clear we'd need a permanent solution as soon as we returned, and you can be sure I fully intend to make them pay for it, every single dollar. This wasn't just about a window, it was about principle. They wanted to return every favor we ever did for them. Fine, I'd take them up on that offer. I was done playing the understanding daughter-in-law. They made their stance perfectly clear. Now I was making mine. But despite all the chaos, Landon and I chose not to let their stunt ruin our weekend. We stayed at the beach, we kept our plans. We walked along the shoreline, held hands under the moonlight, and let ourselves pretend for a moment that the rest of the world didn't exist, that we were just two people who loved each other, free from the madness of family expectations. Then came the final blow. As I had predicted, the DA dropped the charges. Apparently Bob had a close friend who was connected to someone in the district attorney's office. Nepotism at its finest. Or maybe they just didn't want to deal with prosecuting a couple of senior citizens. Either way, it felt like a betrayal of justice. Still, I didn't press the issue. Nothing had been stolen, and aside from the shattered window, nothing inside our home had been damaged or touched. I had no idea what they were trying to accomplish. Were they looking for Landon, trying to confront me, steal something symbolic? I honestly didn't care anymore. But I wasn't going to let it slide either. I've already prepared a legal notice demanding repayment for the damages. I sent them a formal email outlining the cost of the broken glass, the installation fees, and every dime we'd ever contributed to them. Since they were so adamant about wanting nothing from me ever again, I was giving them the chance to back up their words. If they wanted to sever ties so badly, they could start by settling their debts. From this point on, Landon and I made a firm decision. If Sheila and Bob were ever invited to any future family events, gatherings, or holiday celebrations, we simply would not attend. And thankfully, the majority of our extended family completely supported that choice. No one tried to guilt us into reconnecting, no one said we were overreacting. In fact, many people went out of their way to say they admired our strength for finally cutting ties. Not a single person had anything positive to say about Sheila and Bob. It turns out that once our side of the story came to light, a lot of others realized how toxic they had been all along. For once, the boundary we set wasn't just respective, it was upheld by everyone around us. The line had been drawn, clear and deep, and this time, we weren't letting anyone cross it. We had spent years trying to keep the peace. Now, we were protecting our own. Now, here we are, almost 1 full year since that chaotic party that marked the beginning of our no-concept journey. I honestly hadn't planned on posting again, but something happened yesterday that I just had to share. I'm pregnant. We found out a couple of weeks ago, and it still feels surreal to say out loud. It wasn't exactly planned, but the moment we saw those 2 lines on the test, it just felt right. Despite being in my late 30s and all the nerves that come with that, we knew we wanted this. We decided to embrace the unexpected joy. Yesterday, we held a small celebration to announce the pregnancy. Close friends and supportive family members came over. It was supposed to be a happy, peaceful day, and it was, at least until the uninvited guests arrived. That's right, Sheila and Bob showed up. A full hour before the party was scheduled to begin, they arrived at our doorstep without warning, without an invitation, and without a shred of shame. I opened the door and there she was, Sheila standing with that same look of forced sincerity she used to wear whenever she wanted something. She said she wanted to put the past behind us now that I was going to be the mother of her grandchild. She actually believed that this milestone in our lives gave her a right to re-enter our world. So I did something I had imagined doing for years. I looked her in the eye, spat on the ground in front of her, just as she had once done to me, and told her to get lost. Then I slammed the door shut in her face. She wasn't done, of course. They kept ringing the bell, over and over, refusing to take the hint. So I opened the door again and warned them, clearly, firmly, and without hesitation, that if they didn't leave immediately, I would call the police again. And this time, I would make sure they didn't walk away without consequences. They demanded to speak with Landon, but he stepped outside and looked at them with pure contempt. He told them, in the most sarcastically bitter tone, that since he was such a worthless loser who contributed nothing, he probably didn't have the right to engage in any meaningful discussion with such perfect, accomplished parents. Then he told them to leave, for good. Humiliated, they finally walked away. Now, with a child on the way, taking no chances, I'm pursuing a restraining order against both of them. I want nothing to do with them, not now, not ever. My priority is the safety and well-being of this baby. And I will not let anyone, especially people who've tried so hard to break me down, come anywhere near this new chapter of my life.